Today we have a very special guest, Michelle Good. Michelle is a writer of Cree ancestry and a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. Her debut novel, Five Little Indians, won the Governor General's Literary Award for English language fiction, among many other accolades. Her latest book, Truth Telling, is a collection of eye-opening personal essays. She's here today to give us a bit of a history lesson ahead of Canada Day, which is fitting as her writing takes an unflinching look at our nation's past and how it still affects the present.
That's what I try to do with my work, is to bust the notion of Indigenous inferiority, to also bust the notion that colonialism is something of the past. As long as it still creates the foundation for our current social institutions, it is not a part of the past, it's a part of the present.
You'll hear a conversation between Michelle and Myan Marcen-Gaudaur, Scotiabank's Director of Social Impact and Reconciliation. They talk about the motivation behind Michelle's writing, the state of reconciliation in Canada, and the concept of radical hope.
If I believe something is possible, then it would be hypocritical for me to then not have a great deal of hope. That's what I refer to as radical hope, and we should all have it.
Before we begin, just a quick warning, this episode contains accounts of violence and mention of suicide. I'm Stephen Maurice, and this is Perspectives. Now, here is Myan Marcen-Gaudaur.
Michelle Good, it is such a gift to have you here with us today. It means the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
We're here because Canada Day is approaching, and it is a day of celebration for many Canadians. And to some extent, I understand. My dad escaped Soviet Czechoslovakia as a young man. He came to Canada seeking freedom and peace and prosperity. And for him, Canada lived up to that standard and expectation. And for him, Canada Day was a day to celebrate that. I'm also a member of the Métis Nation of Ontario and proud descendant of the Chippewa of Rama First Nation. And through that lens, I feel that Canada Day could really benefit from being a day of reflection and learning to better understand the true history of Canada. And so you are a lifelong writer, an advocate, one of the most prominent Indigenous voices of our time. And for me, there's no better person to explore Canada's true history than you.
Thank you.
Your previous book, Five Little Indians, it was an award-winning work of fiction, although many of us heard the truth behind those really unforgettable characters and their lives. Your new book, Truth Telling, is different. It is raw, it is personal, it doesn't sit behind that veil of fiction. Truth Telling covers a number of really important topics, beginning with the idea that Canada's history of colonization is not yet history. It is the truth we need to ground ourselves in. And so what do you say to someone who operates under the false impression that Canada's colonial history is a thing of the past?
Well, I'd say just look around you. Look at the inequities that we see in the quality of life of Indigenous people versus non-Indigenous people. As long as the impacts of colonialism are still being felt, they're not historical, they're current. And I think a person would be hard-pressed to provide any kind of supported analysis that colonialism is a thing of the past. As long as its impacts are being felt, it's not. As long as it still creates the foundation for our current social institutions, it is not a part of the past, it's a part of the present.
The chapter entitled 1369 is deeply personal. It addresses the racism experienced in your own family. It reveals the trauma, PTSD, the attempts of suicide resulting from being a victim of the 60s scoop. This could not have been an easy chapter to write for you, and certainly not to put in front of editors and agents for critique and opinion, let alone for public consumption. What was the motivation?
Well, a lot of people have asked, did I experience some kind of catharsis or release from doing this? And the answer to that is no, that wasn't the point. The point was much like the reason that I chose to characterize my characters in Five Little Indians was to personalize them, was to make that experience more personal, more individual, and in that way, hoping that people could respond to it that way, that they could perhaps feel it on a more visceral level. And so I thought that if I could personalize the experience of the 60 scoop through my own experience, that more people would be able to appreciate what hundreds of thousands of kids have gone through and are going through. And so, with your earlier question about how do you address the question of isn't the whole colonial history in the past, all we need to do is look at the child welfare system. And, I mean, plug your ears, but I often refer to the child welfare system as the bastard child of the residential school system, where that system wound down and the child welfare system took its place. And it's operating to this day. Despite the work of superstars like Cindy Blackstock, we still have a child welfare system that is apprehending children at a phenomenal rate, Indigenous children, and it is destroying further the social fabric of Indigenous communities. And so how can we think of colonialism as being done when we see that going on? And so that's what I hope to do by telling my own story or portions of my own story, was so that people could maybe wrap their heads around it in a more intimate way with their own emotions wrapped up in it as well.
Something that really stuck with me was your grandmother in particular, how she behaved around your mother. She was incredibly cruel. I mean, she was racist towards your mother. And I'm curious to know if you ever had a different relationship with her.
Yeah. Well, what's so ironic about it is that when her health started to fail a little bit, not a lot, but when she needed some support, it was my mother that provided it to her. But one of the questions that I pose in that discussion about my grandmother, I always think of my Indigenous grandmother when people say my grandmother.
Interesting.
One of the questions that I pose about that whole dynamic between my mother and her mother-in-law, who was a non-Indigenous person, was I asked, was she a monster? And the answer to that is no. And again, it's to try to demonstrate she was a prairie woman of her day. She was typical. Okay. So again, if you extrapolate that experience of racism, that notion of racism that she carried just so deeply in her core being, if you will, and then multiply it by the rest of the population, then you get a better sense of how challenging it is to be an Indigenous person living in a non-Indigenous world when all of these people at that time had those same perceptions. I have no hesitation in suggesting that that was the most common perspective of Indigenous people at the time, that we were, just, ooh, right? So that was very articulate. But that we were inferior and to be avoided at all costs, certainly in your family tree.
And then those perceptions are passed on to the next generation.
Yeah. I mean, we take it back further. And when you think about the people that were behind the residential school legacy, the people that created these terrible laws, people like Duncan Campbell Scott and so on, and you think about what their children heard, what they overheard at the knee of their parent. And, there's a lot of talk about Indigenous oral history, but we're not the only ones that have oral history. Ours is quite unique, but you think about what word of mouth has done to subsequent generations from those people who established these incredibly racist systems in this country. Yeah, and it just passes on and on and on, and it continues. And that's what I try to do with my work, is to bust the notion of Indigenous inferiority, to also bust the notion that colonialism is something of the past, because it isn't.
I want to go back to 1369 again. The ability to calculate one's financial value seems to be uniquely Indigenous. Your value was determined at 1369, and I don't know how many non-Indigenous people can put a number on their worth. You are not alone in your justified anger and criticism of how the 60 scoop, among other atrocities, have been settled in Canada. How might have the settlement been structured so as to be restorative rather than further degrading to Indigenous life?
Well, what I did was I calculated my $25,000 settlement, and everybody got $25,000, and calculated it down to per diem rate. And that was my per diem rate in foster care, $13.69. And my question was, does that make up for all of the hideous things that I experienced in foster care? But what it points to is this ultimately colonial system that only knows how to compensate with dollars. They have no concept of recognizing how family systems were broken down, family values were treated so poorly. There's no way of compensating for that in the Canadian legal system except with money. And so it can't be restorative. It's not even compensatory. It's just, here's some money, now go away. Right? Yeah, this is the end of our responsibility. We'll just give you some money. If it was restorative, then in addition to any kind of individual compensation, there would have been resources provided to Indigenous communities, both urban and rural, both on reserve and off reserve, that would give us the resources we need to create our own healing institutions, our own healing methods to assist in restoring the ways that we used to do things before those things were challenged and attacked. And I don't want to say destroyed because they do still exist, but limited our ability to address healing in our own ways. And this is something that I say about residential schools as well, is that we experience those things on an individual basis, but we experience them on a collective basis as well. And so compensation, in order to really be meaningful, must be collective as well. And it must look at not just the individual experience, but the impact on a people as a whole. And should we be able to get there, then maybe we can start thinking about reconciliation.
And it's not too late.
Oh, I call it radical hope. I have these quotes all over. You should see my office. It's ridiculous. But I have these quotes all over the place. And one of them is from a man named Raymond Williams, who provided the foundation for my concept of radical hope. And I'll see if I can find it. But he says, the most radical thing that you can do is to be hopeful in a circumstance that appears hopeless. So my take on that and my perspective and my view is that if I believe something is possible, and I certainly believe that we can be restored, that we can meet our own needs again, then it would be hypocritical for me to then not have a great deal of hope. And so that's what I refer to as radical hope. And we should all have it.
I really love that. Radical hope.
Yeah.
You provide important context on a lot of issues that listeners may have heard of but can't yet contextualize. The Indian Act, the doctrine of discovery, the residential school system, identity, the colonial act of pretendians, and the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited peoples. Indigenous women continue to feel like ghosts in their own life, as you know. For Scotiabank employees and others who work with Indigenous women, they're only a few degrees separated from a story of assault or disappearance or murder of an Indigenous woman, and yet the crisis remains taboo. How did this crisis come to be? What are its roots?
Colonialism. And that's actually a subject that I'm addressing in my new novel. And the way I pose the question in my head is, how is it that Indigenous women became disposable? And that's what it is. We have always been considered disposable and a commodity to be used to achieve colonial objectives. One of the examples that I use in having that conversation is that in the very early days of the fur trade, when Indigenous men were not prepared to engage in a capitalist economy, they weren't prepared to hunt and trap for profit, for surplus. They had only ever taken what was needed from the earth in terms of hunting and trapping. But, because it was a capitalist system that was behind the fur industry, the Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Company, and so on, they insisted that Indigenous men just hunt for profit, hunt for surplus, and bring in these big piles of furs and so on and so forth. And they didn't want to do it, so they would kidnap their wives. They would hold their wives hostage and they wouldn't allow them to return to their family until the men agreed to do that. And then during the times of starvation that we went through because of the utter destruction of the buffalo, and I speak, primarily in that context about the prairies, women were taken advantage of by Northwest Mounted Police, by Indian Act officials, well, they are the same thing, Indian Affairs officials, and they were just perceived as currency, girls and women. And some of the people like Hayter Reed was one of the driving forces behind the residential school system. And he had taken a 13-year-old girl to live with him when he was in the field. And then when they were done with these girls, they just toss them out, get rid of them, right? And so there is this long-standing absolute disregard for the value of Indigenous women. But on the other side of the coin, there was the recognition of the role that Indigenous women played in their community. And that, in my opinion, was another objective to neutralizing and preying on Indigenous women to weaken the community. One example I use is when the Indian Act was such that if a non-Indigenous man married an Indigenous woman, she would lose her legal status as an Indian person in Canada. And I use that word intentionally. And people originally would talk about that in the context of it being sexist. But the other way that I look at it is that it wasn't just an act of sexism. It was an act of assimilation and termination, because you're taking Indigenous women away from the community and away from their role in the community. And not only that, but if a non-Indigenous woman married an Indigenous man, she became legally an Indian. Okay, so you're taking Indigenous women out of the community, you're bringing non-Indigenous women into the community. And so you're taking away the generations upon generations of knowledge in these women. You're taking it away from the community and you're bringing in the non-Indigenous influence into the community. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't just sexism, right? It was part of that broader colonial picture designed to assimilate, terminate, and be done with us.
There was something that you said on this topic that really struck with me as it relates to my own ancestry. You talked about Canadian traders and how by the 1790s, they routinely took women from their own families to ensure payments of debt and sold them to company employees, as you just touched on. I descend from a Canadian fur trader and his wife, who is the daughter of Chief Big Shilling. Her English name was Mary, and she was my third great-grandmother. Like her and many of her descendants, I still carry the name of that fur trader, Gaudaur. We know a lot about our family history, but the circumstances that instigated their union isn't well known. And I'm really grateful to you for shedding a light on what might have been, but it also hurts my soul to the core to think about.
Yeah, my great-grandmother had some pretty horrific experiences. And again, in this new novel I'm working on, I'm basing one of the main characters on her experience during that time. It's actually, she was born in 1856, right at the beginning of the decimation of the buffalo herds and the impact that had on Indigenous communities. But again, you see the role of resource extraction at its simplest, okay? Now we're seeing resource extraction in minerals and forestry and pipelines and all of that kind of stuff. But back then, the resource extraction was the destruction of game. The buffalo, there was a period of time in my research where certain Indigenous people called certain years certain things, okay? One of them was the year we ate the dogs. The other one was the year we ate the horses. The other one was the year we ate roots and rodents, okay? And this was all in response to the destruction of the foundation of Plains Indigenous peoples, which was the destruction of the buffalo. And Lewis and Clark came through the prairies, like right around where Yellowstone is, like the juncture of Yellowstone and the Missouri River. And they said they couldn't see grass all they could see was buffalo.
Wow.
There was buffalo as far as the eye could see in every direction. Another expedition came out to try and get a buffalo hide and head for a museum and couldn't find a single buffalo, not one. And when you think that your food, clothing, shelter, lodging, everything, your tools came from the bones of buffalo, your clothing from the hide, your lodges from the hide, your food, everything came from the buffalo, and everything was taken away, just destroyed in a frighteningly short period of time. And if it weren't for the establishment of Yellowstone Park and Preserve, they would have been all gone, because that was the only place it was set up to protect them primarily.
The death of the buffalo was its own genocide, wasn't it? And it really was just a matter of years.
Yeah, and it's the same genocide. The genocide of the buffalo was the genocide of Indigenous people. Their lives were so intricately linked. Yeah, and something that nobody cared about or even thought about while it was going on. There was just no regard for the impact of that, and not only on people, but on the landscape. And that's something that people are just, well, in recent history, starting to understand the impact of the buffalo on the grasslands ecosystems, and how when they would wallow, it would create basins for water collection, so new plants would grow there. So the whole ecosystem of the grasslands was deeply compromised by the genocide of the buffalo. Yeah.
It has been almost 10 years since the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action. Truth is central, yet many organizations rush to reconciliation without truth, which I know is a grievance I have heard from many Indigenous leaders. Scotiabank has heard that call for truth and has committed to keeping truth central to our journey of reconciliation. But for leaders of other organizations, or for future leaders of our own, what is the harm to progress if reconciliation is not rooted in the truth?
It's not just important to reconciliation, it's a precedent. It's a necessary precedent, because if we achieve truth and Canada's history is rewritten to incorporate the experience through an Indigenous lens, then we're on a level playing field. Then we have mutually agreed on what happened, what harm was done, and what has to be done to turn it around and to reshape the relationship between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people based on the truth of history. So it's not just a preferred route, it's necessary. It's a precedent, just like a legal precedent. It's like one can't exist without the other. And we're seeing that, right? Reconciliation is failing quite horribly, even though I'll be the first person to say that relations have improved over time. And I'm old enough now that I can look back and go, oh my God, things are so much better in some ways. But if you look at, I don't know if you're familiar with the Yellowhead Institute, it's an Indigenous think tank. And the Yellowhead Institute does a favor to Canada by monitoring the number of the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that have been implemented. And as of this year, of the 94, 13 have been implemented. 13 in 10 years. Why? Why are we having such a hard time implementing the calls to action? And it's because we're not on a level playing field. We're trying to resolve something that requires decolonization without telling the truth of history, which is to expose the impacts of colonization. If we could depoliticize it, which I think is probably impossible, but if we could, and just think about this as trying to create a balanced relationship based on truth, we might get somewhere. But, it's really quite pitiful how little has been accomplished since then.
And truth, as you say, it must come first. It is step one. But there's more to it than that. And Scotiabank will launch its first comprehensive Truth and Reconciliation Action Plan later this year. It is rooted in the principles of aware, care, and action. We know that if folks don't know, they won't care. And if they don't care, they won't act. Knowledge and that truth piece is fundamental from the start, but silence and inaction can continue to contribute to that culture of colonization. And so with that in mind, how do we get people to move from knowledge to action?
Well, you're right. They have to care about it. I think that Canadians are struggling in a lot of ways right now with a difficult economy. And with not only that, but we are moving into the end stages of capitalism. And, what that is where we have this tiny percentage of the world that holds on to the vast majority of wealth in the world. And the rest of the population is just struggling to survive. And in North America, we're very fortunate that we have been able to maintain a standard of living that we've been able to maintain for this long. But if we look in other places around the world, the struggle is intense. And unfortunately, if I'm struggling with how I'm going to feed my kids, I'm not thinking very much about Indigenous issues. And so when you see that, you see it woven into a much bigger picture. And there's many things that need to be fixed, as well as the issues that demand reconciliation. And so that's why I think it is that people don't take that leap from awareness to action. And I think Indigenous people, without the input of others, have done a remarkable job of surviving in this world that was so profoundly changed. But not only that, not just surviving, but ensuring that the future will still have the potential for a return to self-determination in our communities. And by that, I mean things like changing the Constitution to recognize Indigenous rights. We did that. Nobody gave that to us. Changing the Constitution is one of the most impossible things to do. And back in 1982, which doesn't seem so far to me, right? We were still just coming out of residential schools. I remember right around the late 70s, if one person in the province I was living in graduated, one Indigenous person from high school, we would have this massive celebration to hold them up and to recognize them, that they achieved this against all the odds. But in that very, very difficult time, we were able to take our advocacy to the point of changing the Constitution. Most impossible thing to do. So we did that, and in doing that, we were able to protect the future to some degree. Now it's just a matter of the legal system upholding its own laws.
We have such a long way to go, but I want to acknowledge, Michelle, I want to acknowledge you and your voice and how hard you have fought to have a voice, despite a system that tried very hard to silence your voice.
Well, thanks. I don't think it would have been possible, frankly. I could never imagine not doing what I felt driven to do, and just wouldn't allow it. But I'd also like to say that one of the great things about being old is that you've got a much greater time period to look back on. And you can look back on a whole range of realities, if you will. And in the 60s and 70s, like I was a teenager in the 60s and the 70s, the kinds of work that we're doing today here would just never have happened. So while I am quick to point out the challenges and the issues and the negative realities of our colonial structure in Canada, I also have to say that it's amazing how non-Indigenous Canadians have come around, have changed their thinking, or are changing their thinking, are reaching out, they're trying to learn to understand and to act. That is quite miraculous when you go back one generation and you find my grandmother horrified that her son was going to marry a Cree woman. That's one generation. So if we can do that in one generation, imagine what the future could look like. And it's the involvement of all levels, all institutional levels in the country in making those changes that will buttress our efforts at reconciliation.
Radical hope.
Radical hope.
It sounds like it's paying off.
Yeah.
Michelle, I want to say thank you. Chimagwech, you have filled my mind and my heart and my soul today. I look forward to next time.
Well, I hope there'll be a next time. I do. And keep up the work you're doing. It's important.
You've been listening to an interview with author Michelle Good. She was speaking with Myan Marcen-Gaudaur, the Director of Social Impact and Reconciliation at Scotiabank. The Perspectives podcast is made by me, Stephen Maurice, as well as Armina Lagaya and our producer, Andrew Norton. For a transcript of this episode, as well as other stories, insights, analysis, and thought leadership, visit our website, scotiabank.com/perspectives. We'll see you next time.